Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 1. Here goes the question. Medieval architecture was foreign in style but Indian in expression. Discuss. You can obviously make some sense of this question. However, what we have to point out here that this question specifically talks about discussing a particular concept. Whenever a question is framed like this, that you have to discuss a particular concept, you should actually thank your luck, because these kinds of questions are more open-ended and they provide you ample opportunity to display your, you could say, novel interpretation of the question, or for that matter the wide knowledge you have something about have about some particular topic. And you should never miss this opportunity. Whenever UPSC gives you an opportunity to display that you have novel ideas, you should always grab that opportunity with both hands, because generally the paper checker appreciates it. Anyway, you are also aware that there are some fundamental differences between Islam and the Indian traditions. Islam prohibits idolatry. Again, most of us are aware here that Islam actually prohibits the idol worship, that is idolatry, and has a preference for aniconism, that is no depiction of persons and animals. That Islam would prefer that animals and persons are not depicted in Islamic architecture or even painting. This differentiates Islam from most of the Indian spiritual traditions, who essentially practice idol worship as well as image making or icon making. Distinctive elements of Islamic architecture like the minar, mihrab, dome, etc. are meant to serve the demands of Islamic practices and doctrines. Again, this is an intuitive point that the elements of Islamic architecture would be they are meant to serve some Islamic doctrine, or for that matter Islamic practices. The adherent Muslim is enjoined to congregate at the mosque. We are giving example here. At the call of the muezzin. Therefore, the minar is necessary to belt out the adhan. Minar is the tar that is attached to a mosque, and it is meant to, you could say, so that the muezzin could climb up and he would make call for the adherent, for the followers of Islam to congregate for the namaz. The Muslims pray kneeling towards Makkah, whose direction is pointed out by the Qibla set in the recess of the mihrab. Actually, mihrab is, you could say, element of Islamic architecture that is essentially, you could say, a recessed wall, and in this recessed wall is the Qibla or the altar set, and this Qibla generally points the direction towards Makkah, to which the Muslims are supposed to kneel. Wide and high domes, again you can understand why domes are provided in Muslim architecture, because the domes make the mosque spacious enough to hold the congregants. Not only the mosques but other specimens of Islamic architecture to reflect Islam's mythology and worldview. The practice of situating tombs, an example being, one of the examples we are giving that how Islamic architecture reflects Islam's mythology and worldview, would be the practice of situating tombs or mausoleums in gardens. That is the Chaharbagh style of architecture. You are well aware that the Islamic, mostly the Mughal mausoleums, they are, you could say, designed according to the Chaharbagh style of architecture. This reflects the Islamic conception of paradise as a garden of plenty. However, if the mosque and mausoleum are distinctively Persian-Arabic, you can understand very well that the architectural elements of mosque and mausoleums, they originated in Persia or Arabia. The secular buildings generally show greater experimentation. We are essentially pointing out that the secular buildings of the medieval period, they adopted elements from India. They experimented with adopting elements from India for various concerns. In fact, as Muslims' rule matured, it became more secure while adopting elements from Indian traditions. You could obviously give the example from Akbar's rule, when the ruler himself was confident enough of, you could say, experimenting with Indian elements as well, adding indigenous touches to even mosques and mausoleums. And the motives for this intermingling were varied. There were actually many motives why this intermingling would be allowed. Sometimes it was practical considerations, sometimes it was the practical requirement that meant that elements from Hindu architecture had to be adopted to Muslim architecture. At others, it was a conscious decision. It was sometimes a conscious political signaling as well, where the at other times, out of sheer habit of coming into and maintaining contacts with Indians, and many a times a combination of the foregoing motives. Sometimes the ruler wanted this to signal to his diverse subjects that he was a, you could say, tolerant person. You could always give the example of Akbar, who actually he explicitly tried to signal it to all of his subjects, whether they be Muslims or non-Muslims, that the ruler was, you could say, someone who had a tolerant attitude towards his diverse subjects. So, what are the Indian elements in Islamic architecture, and what were some of the rationale behind, some of the reasons behind adopting them? Sometimes it was due to some cultural practices which were peculiar to India. An example being that the practice of Jharokha Darshan, which meant that a balcony had to be added to the building. Actually, the practice of Jharokha Darshan was the practice of the ruler giving, you could say, glance to his subjects every day. Actually, at the start of the day, the ruler came to the balcony, that is the Jharokha, and he, you could say, made an appearance before his subjects. And you can understand why this was so, because the subjects had to be assured that the ruler was indeed alive and in good health. And for this requirement, the best architectural element, the best structure was the balcony, which was the Jharokha. This practice essentially was adopted from the Rajput style of architecture, but due to this requirement of, you could say, giving, you could glance to his subjects, it was adopted into the Mughal architecture, and it continued from Akbar's time till at least Shah Jahan's time, before Aurangzeb banned the practice of Jharokha Darshan. Granting audience to the supplicant, that is the petitioners, you could say petitioners, and this was served by the pillared court, that is the pillared hall. Actually, you can understand very well, as a large number of subjects came to present their petition to the ruler's court. It was required that a large hall had to be constructed for them, and at that point the best suited structure was the pillared hall. Sometimes it was the handiwork of the indigenous architect, the indigenous artisan who were, you could say, co-opted in the Mughal architectural, you could say, teams, and they brought ornamental elements like the bell and lotus, which as we would see later, these elements were adopted in the Islamic architecture, in the Mughal architecture mostly, and some of the specimens are from the well-known Taj Mahal. And there were even chances that some of the elements could be harmonized with Islamic doctrine. There were some Indian elements, some essentially Indian elements, which could be harmonized, which could be, you could say, understood to be in consonance with the Islamic doctrines. An example being the finial, which is an architectural element that is akin to the kalash. We would repeat it. The finial is an architectural element in mostly Muslim architecture, mostly Mughal architecture, that is quite akin to the kalash at the top of the Hindu temples. Now, elaborating on these points, sagacious rulers like Akbar, sagacious means wise, sagacious rulers like Akbar found it politically expedient to appeal to indigenous sensibilities as well. So they adopted practices like Jharokha Darshan, that is, granting a direct glance to the subject. And you can understand very, very well that it was the balcony or the Jharokha that best facilitated this, and it became part of the Mughal palaces starting with Fatehpur Sikri. After Fatehpur Sikri, the Jharokha, the balcony, was added to the Mughal architecture. Moreover, also appreciate that India was quite populous, as now India was most populous of all the Muslim domains, all the Muslim realms, and the capital Delhi as of now was the most crowded. And to grant audience to large number of supplicants, that is the petitioners, the large number of petitioners, the multi-pillared large hall was best suited. An example being the Diwan-e-Aam at the Red Fort is one instance. Again, if you were to go back in history, the practice of multi-pillared hall appeared in India very, very early. You are probably aware that at Kumharar, during the Mauryan period, at Kumharar Patna, the Mauryan, you could say, capital, Patliputra, Kumharar had a multi-pillared hall. And the example of Diwan-e-Aam shows that this element, the multi-pillared halls, was adopted to Islamic architecture, the Mughal architecture as well. Moreover, please appreciate that as more local artisans joined Mughal building efforts, they naturally brought elements from native practices. This is perhaps why the bell and lotus symbol along with elephants were adopted. An example being the Taj Mahal. We have already talked that Islam has a preference for an iconism. That is, it again explicitly does not say that the elements, that the animals should not be depicted, but it would prefer that the animals would not be depicted at Islamic architecture. Despite this, you could say, preference for an iconism, there was instance that the animals were depicted. An obvious example would be Taj Mahal, where elephants have been depicted. Then some Indian ideas were always in harmony with conceptions of Islam. Sometimes it is possible that Islam and the Indian traditions, for example Hinduism, have, you could say, some similarity for some particular doctrine, some particular issues, they might have some similarity. For instance, the colors at the top of temples pointed towards the supreme realm of heaven. Actually, it is said that the colors signifies the unity of the three realms. We would repeat it. The color signifies the unity of the three realms of heaven, sky, as well as earth. And you can understand very, very well that even Islamic geography has the very same conception. They do accept that there is a heaven, and they obviously accept that there is an earth too. So this was, you could say, not out of, you could say, out of the, you could say, provisions of the Islamic doctrine, that the colors could be adopted in the Islamic architecture in the form of the finial as well. And the finial, it first appears at Humayun's tomb, and it imitated the colors, as we have already talked about. Moreover, please also appreciate that despite we have talked that there were some, you could say, harmony between Islamic and Hindu, or for that matter Indian conceptions, there was another practical concern also. The example of finial would show this. The finial also made the tomb still more majestic. It added to its height a status that befits the glory of the Mughal emperor, the mighty Mughal emperor. So again, you can understand very, very well, adding the colors, or for that matter the finial atop a building, it would make the building appear still majestic, still higher, and that would you could say, signal to the worldwide that the Muslim domain, that the Mughal domain was a mighty one. Now, the conclusion is, while medieval Muslim architecture could still be differentiated from indigenous architecture, the requirement of appealing to native subjects, Indian artisans in employ of Muslim rulers, and practical concerns, as we have just talked about, giving the example of the fenial, to adopt elements which were also justifiable to Islamic doctrine. All of these combine to give medieval architecture and Indian interpretation. Or we can say that the Muslim architecture, essentially of the Mughal period, of the later medieval period, it had an Indian expression despite being of foreign origin. So this was all on the origin of the Muslim architecture, that is its foreign origin, and despite which it had essentially Indian expression. That is all for today. We would reassemble for the next lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.